Right, well, thanks for everyone for joining us either in the room here or online. If this is your first time joining us for one of our seminars, my name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And Sustainable Energy Seminar Series is something we do every fall and spring, every other Monday, to bring together lots of different disciplines, lots of different campus experts who share their expertise on sustainable energy challenges and solutions. So throughout the series, you'll hear from folks in social sciences and humanities to science and technology and engineering, with the goal of kind of broadening perspectives and understanding of many different ways that different disciplines understand energy challenges and develop solutions. The seminar is open to the public, but it's also a course for students in the Certificate in Engineering for Energy Sustainability, as well as the Master's in Sustainable Systems Engineering. We're offering this as a hybrid format, so you're welcome to join us in person at the Wisconsin Energy Institute every other Monday during the fall and spring semesters, as well as through our Zoom webinar platform. We do have live captioning available if you're joining us online. If you'd like to turn on that feature, just click on the CC button or show captions. And please use the Q&A for our presenter. If you do have any questions, I'll be monitoring that and chat as well. With that, this is our final seminar of the semester. So we'll hope to see you all back here in late January. And if you're on our mailing list or if you signed up, I'll let you know about our upcoming seminars then. Tyler Lark is a lead scientist with the Center for Sustainability in the Global Environment, SAGE, which is part of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. His research focuses on the interactions between land use change and agriculture. And so he'll be talking about those topics and how they interact with biofuels and sustainability. So, okay.
Thanks for having me. And so, what do you think sitting is the best, or
I think
are we using?
I think sitting
and talking
because I think Mike will pick it up better.
Okay, great. And for people who are listening live, I guess enter into the chat if you can't hear me well, because Scott's monitoring that. And I'll do my best. Usually I'm a pretty animated speaker. I'm like up here waving my hands around, pointing at things. And I'll try to I'll do my best to convey that maybe through moving my mouse around a lot on screen for everyone joining us remotely. And we'll see how it goes. We'll have fun. Thanks for having me. This is a great topic to talk about. Yeah, well, I guess just dive right in. Gonna just chat kind of three big picture things, tying them all together here today. One, just background on land use. That's the perspective I'm coming at this from, and why that matters for biofuels. Why is biofuels related to land use? Why are these two things even mentioned together? Then this example of corn ethanol. So we just finished a recent study looking at corn ethanol, sort of a case study, and the impacts of the policy that governs corn ethanol production, which is the Renewable Fuel Standard. And then we'll really just look at much more broadly and towards the future. What are the opportunities to really create some sustainable bioenergy solutions? So what can we learn from bioenergy development over the last decade or two to create leaner, greener solutions moving forwards? So before we get into all that, I also just thought I'd throw in a slide of who I am. Like, why am I sitting here talking about biofuels and land use and all of that? If I were to describe myself, I guess I would say I'm an agricultural geographer. Other people in our community sometimes branded themselves or start saying we're land system scientists, which I think captures it pretty well. We kind of study the causes and consequences of land use and the characteristics of it and how those land systems operate. My background is actually in engineering, so a little bit more on the technical side. And then I did my PhD here at UW-Madison in the Nelson Institute's Environment and Resources program. And my focus there was on quantifying U.S. agricultural land use change. And I've been studying that for over a decade now. And since finishing up grad school, I stayed on here as a scientist. I've been fortunate enough to stay here at UW-Madison and now lead a small team of about 4 or 5 of us. We're all focused on mapping U.S. agriculture and its environmental impacts and opportunities to improve conservation. All of our research is very much applied and has a very strong kind of policy relevant focus. So we look at, questions about the environment and land use, but where does that intersect with real opportunities to make change? And I think policy is a great opportunity to do that. And so a lot of our research is nationwide, and we look at, where these federal policies intersect with agriculture and conservation on the landscape. And just myself, I grew up in Wisconsin, in rural Wisconsin, on a small farm. I worked on our neighbor's dairy farm growing up as a kid. And, I'm not directly involved in production agriculture anymore, except my wife and I have 2 chickens that we keep in our backyard in downtown Madison. So it's like my small little snippet that I think keeps me grounded. And, we like to get outside and do, camping, hunting, fishing, all that as much as possible. So, growing up and even still now, I really got to experience that intersection of, I think, agriculture and conservation on a daily basis. And that's really influenced my career trajectory and what keeps me excited about being able to work in this really kind of high impact field with a lot of opportunity to make change. So that's me. That's why I'm here. I'll just pretend you're all giving nice introductions of yourself right now as well. And great to have you here as well. So where does this agriculture and conservation tie into biofuels? So just a little bit of background. This is just a generic random slide that I pulled from the internet. It kind of gives one idea of the carbon cycle associated with biofuels. And I'm sure you've all seen something similar to this. You're pulling CO2 from the atmosphere, drawing it down into the crops, harvest those, and then use that to create energy or fuel that you can use for transportation. And a huge benefit of this, rather than say gasoline or any other petroleum-based fuels, we're not pumping and pulling a bunch of old dead carbon out of the ground from thousands or millions of years ago and kicking into the atmosphere. It's sort of this circular process, right? And so the idea is that biofuels perhaps are or can be inherently carbon neutral, or there's a concept called biogenic carbon, and then that it may be carbon neutral. There's discussion and nuances around that, but in general, this is the concept and why there is excitement about bioenergy and biofuels as a potential sustainable fuel source and a way to help us decarbonize, especially our transportation fuel supply, which right now relies so heavily on fossil fuels. So a lot of promise there and a lot of interest. As biofuels really started to come online, say in the mid 2000s, or started to expand. I mean, we've had biofuels throughout history. A little bit more increasing concern or interest in some of the land use impacts. So this idea that really you can have land use change or indirect land use change resulting from using croplands for biofuels. So if you were to divert a bunch of land in the United States that's growing corn and soybeans and start using that to produce biofuels, that land or those crops are going to have to potentially be made up somewhere else. And the concern, a decade or two ago was that, well, what if farmers in Brazil say, well, okay, we'll make up that shortfall in soybeans and start clearing the Amazon to plant soybeans, and you potentially release a lot of carbon emissions from that land use change. Could that then offset the other benefits that you'd get from biofuels in their displacement of petroleum? And so that's really where a lot of the initial concern and interest, I think, around the intersection of land use and biofuels started. But it was, I think, largely focused in the tropics and concerns about things like tropical deforestation. Bringing that to where we are today, and our focus as a research team is really land use right here in the United States. And so we don't see a whole lot of tropical deforestation in the United States, but we do have this dynamic interaction between croplands and grasslands. And so that's kind of the dynamic depicted here, is the conversion from grasslands to cultivated crops. And the reason I think this is so interesting is it's globally, grasslands are one of the most human modified biomes in the world. So like half of all grasslands have been appropriated for agriculture, for human use, primarily cultivated agriculture. And in the US, that dynamic holds true as well. So about half of all of our historic grassland extent is now plowed up as cultivated crops. And so it's these two land uses are really intricately tied together, and it's that dynamic that continues to sort of play out on the landscape today. And if you're wondering, like, well, why do we care about grasslands? Well, grasslands are actually pretty cool. They provide a ton of ecosystem services or benefits to humanity. They do a lot of good for water quality. They reduce soil erosion and filter sediment, and tons of recreational opportunities, whether it's bird watching or hunting. They provide critical habitat for a lot of species, including threatened and endangered species. And they also provide a lot of production. So via grazing and agricultural production directly on the grasslands, harvesting the biomass for fodder and feed. I don't know where that picture is. Also a randomly stolen photo from the internet. Yeah, Horton Marsh, there was a lot of stuff. So how do we look at these things? Why do we look at these things? Well, we want to know, we study it from this angle of where are land use changes happening, when, why, and we care about it because we want to know what are the implications for crop yields and food production, because that is a key factor in, really society's well-being. And, what are the impacts for wildlife and habitat and carbon emissions? And what are the effects of policy and for policies? And a lot of that directs our team's research towards these national level assessments of federal policies. So we look at things like the US federal farm policies in the Farm Bill and this policy called the Renewable Fuel Standard, which I'll talk more about today, because that obviously relates closely to biofuels. How do we study this? I'm kind of just going to skip the slide, but just to give an idea, a lot of what we do is satellite-based. We use satellite-based land cover mapping, so you can get really detailed images of how we use our land across the country down to like the field level. So we know basically for every field across the US what's planted every year and what's growing. We combine that with survey data and a lot of other ground-based data sources to sort of triangulate and get a really good understanding. We do a bunch of spatial temporal processing to see how changes occur across time and across space. We track both net and gross changes. So like, we don't just say, oh, in general, acreage of corn went up. We say, well, corn went up by a few hundred acres here and down by, a few thousand there. And so looking at kind of the holistic picture, and all that really helps give us some detailed insights at new resolutions and new levels that help us assess outcomes of different policies and programs and initiatives. Just a quick couple of slides on kind of what we're seeing on the landscape today as sort of a segue to get us into how that connects to biofuels. So in the last about decade, from 2008 to 2016, we've seen significant expansion of cropland into these other land uses like grasslands. And so everywhere shown in red on this map here are areas of substantial cropland expansion. So you really see some hotspots in like eastern Dakotas and southern Iowa, and here in over the Ogallala Aquifer and the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma and western Kansas, quite a bit of cropland expansion throughout the country, such that it is actually about 10 million acres of land was converted to crop production over the last decade or so, while at the same time only about 3 million acres went from crop production back into, say, a less intensive or natural or semi-natural land cover use. And so we're seeing a net change or overall net expansion of crop area in the United States today. And this is really a change from the trend that was going on for the past 3 or 4 decades prior. So, since the mid 80s or so, cropland area had been on the decline. We've been, yields have been increasing. We didn't need as much land. We were enrolling more land into conservation programs. And then around the mid 2000s, all of a sudden we saw this reversal in the trend where we see this little uptick. And now all of a sudden croplands are expanding again into other areas, sometimes in areas where they used to be crops and sometimes into new locations. And so, what does this conversion look like? It's plowing up of old pastures or other grasslands and clearing new land to make way for more crop production. By ecosystem type, of the 4 major, the main source of new cropland in the United States is grassland. So as I mentioned, we don't have tropical deforestation here. We don't have a ton of other land uses that are getting converted to agriculture other than grasslands, although there is quite a bit of wetland conversion in this region known as the prairie potholes of North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota especially. And some forests, that's not things like deforestation, that's more usually like timber plantations or, pulp paper being harvested, and then rather than replanting that timber for another 30-year cycle, Just due to the economics at the time, it looks like, people putting it then maybe into agriculture rather than back into forestry. But in general, grasslands is where new crop production comes from in the United States. And we also see that some of it, about 20%, looks like it's pretty long-term, like permanent or maybe even native grasslands. So, if you think of prairie or extensive rangeland out west, areas that haven't really been used for crop production before, but are starting to are newly moving into crop production. So you see in sort of orange here, moving western across the US, sort of this frontier of agriculture moving into green is where you have those more extensive grassland areas. Tying this sort of back to biofuels and where it initially connects is, well, on this converted lands, the crops that are generally planted, the number 1 and 2 crops are corn and soybeans. And so anything shown here in green, the soybeans, or yellow is corn. So you can see on a lot of the newly converted land across the US, these 2 major crops, which are very common biofuel feedstock crops or crops that are used to produce biofuels, are planted on that converted land. Now you might say, well, what's the problem? That's great. We're getting more production, more like value out of our land. Isn't this a great thing? And in a sense, yeah, you could look at it, economically we are being more productive on our land. But in fact, for farmers, it's not that good of a investment. We're getting less bang for our buck. So yields on these newly converted croplands are lower than existing croplands or our national averages. So we're moving into areas that are both sort of lower quality locally, and also in lower productive regions of the country. So we're moving farther west, and here in this map, for example, anywhere in red, yields are sometimes 50% of the national average. Or we're getting like half as much per acre as we are on our existing cropland. And so we're continuing to get basically less bang for our buck as we continue to expand crop area. And for that reason, you'd really want to try to minimize these types of land use changes. From a climate sense, there's also some relatively big trade-offs. So the carbon emissions when you plow up these grasslands and plant crops are substantial, on the order of about 32 teragrams of carbon per year. What does that mean? Well, that's the equivalent of about 6 coal-fired power plants operating for a year, or 20 million additional cars on the road. Most of this comes from the soil. And interestingly, the emissions from this land use change in the US are huge. They're greater than the annual emissions from the clearing of the Brazilian Cerrado. So the Cerrado is this savanna-like ecosystem in southern Brazil and other parts of South America. Kind of a mixture of grasses and trees, and it's gained a lot of attention as land use changes moved sort of away from tropical deforestation in the heart of the Amazon into some of these shoulder ecosystems. And transitional ecosystems. People are saying, hey, we don't want to destroy those native ecosystems as well. But really, right here in our own backyard, we have emissions from land use change that are on the same level and order of magnitude as some of these other ones. And when you think about it, the losses of carbon from US grasslands are also in a sense less recoverable, because soil organic carbon accumulates much slower than biomass. So if you were to clear an acre of land to plant a crop and say 5 years from now, be like, oh, you know what, that's a mistake. We should go back to that natural ecosystem. If it was a forest that you cleared, you can replant trees and maybe regain quite a bit of that carbon stored in the tree biomass in a couple of decades. But if it was a grassland with tons of carbon stored in its soil, I mean, it can take centuries, if not longer, to recover that soil organic matter. And so for that reason, it's a little bit less recoverable, it's less reversible, and just kind of adds a little bit more weight to these types of emissions.
Is the Cerrado, is that in the northeast part of the
I think it stretches a lot, if the Amazon is like in the northwest, it's in the other parts or between that and the coast. Yeah. And I think it goes into other countries as well down there, Argentina. Yeah. But I don't know my South American geography as well as I should. Yeah. Good question. And the one other point of this is just simply protecting grasslands and preventing this conversion to crop production has been identified as like the #1 nature-based or natural climate solution in the US agricultural sector. And so there's a lot of things that we can be doing in the ag sector to improve conservation and climate and carbon sequestration, cover crops and conservation tillage and nutrient management. But simply avoiding grassland conversion here, so like preventing the additional conversion of land, is the number one option and would give us the most benefits across the entire grassland and agricultural sector in the United States. And I sort of think about that as like this kind of triage concept of, in the medical field of like, we just need to stop the bleeding. Like right now, anytime you plow up a grassland and planted crops, you're basically hemorrhaging carbon into the atmosphere. And so, just stopping that will go a long ways, and then we can start to make and start to make all these additional gains in agriculture that we can and should. So that's kind of the background and motivation of like why. Hopefully that convinced you. You're like, oh yeah, land use change, at least here in the US, is bad. We don't want to plow up a bunch of natural ecosystems because we'll lose a bunch of carbon and wildlife and other things. So it remains really a big challenge in the United States. So nationwide, we're losing about 1 million acres a year, even when crop prices go down, because we're also losing agricultural lands too. And so it's a challenge. I won't get much more into that dynamic, but urban expansion, urban sprawl, we're eating up our best and highest quality ag lands all the time. So, maybe what I was talking about here sounds like, oh, agriculture is this bad villain, it's expanding the grasslands and our natural ecosystems. That's not at all the case. It's being driven by a lot of these other factors, but it's that interface that, can help us understand the interaction. And we see that crops are moving into lower quality areas and less productive regions with lower yields. We're getting less bang for our buck, but it continues to come at really high environmental costs. So I didn't show it, but we've done research showing that the types of lands that get converted are disproportionately higher quality habitat for a lot of wildlife and have really high carbon emissions as well. So we've got that as a basis. Hopefully you're like, all right, save the grasslands. How do we do that? The cool thing I think about biofuels is, well, thus far, it's, some types of biofuels can contribute to the loss of grasslands. However, there's a ton of potential for biofuels to contribute to their restoration, and they're bringing them back onto the landscape. And so that's kind of the next two pieces. I'm going to talk about this example of corn ethanol, which is known as more of this first generation conventional biofuel. It's, developed and you produce it from growing corn or type of crop. And then after that, I'll shift and talk about some of these future next generation biofuels or cellulosic biofuels, where you actually produce a fuel from the plant matter itself, from the grass and from all different parts of the plant, such that you can basically harvest grasses and use those for fuels. I see something popped up in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to wait to address that question before you go through, because I think
Let's
you might
see.
sort of address.
Are there any larger volume crops that would have characteristics similar to grasslands? For example, large oils. Yeah, let's use it. It's a good segue. Yes, right. So there's large volume. I mean, even corn. I think corn is like genetically a grassland or something, right? Or a grass. So like corn is a very productive grassland, but it's managed very intensively with tillage and tons of fertilizer, and it's just a very leaky system. You lose a lot of nitrogen to the environment, right? And you lose soil erosion and a lot of things. And we're making strides and doing better, but that's, I think, what holds it back in some senses is a land use system. And there are other crops, things like native perennial grasses. Switchgrass is one that's really common and popular, and you may have heard of. So, it's a perennial grass. It's a native grass. And rather than like rows of perfectly manicured corn with a lot of bare soil in between it, you have greater coverage of the soil, much less soil erosion, and has, it's a larger volume crop. It's quite productive. And there's other ones too. There's like sorghum is a crop that's been proposed as a bioenergy crop that's quite productive, and a lot of other kind of more research-based ones, miscanthus and things that people are looking into. So I would say the answer is yes. And that's the hope, is can we use some of these crops that have a more preferential environmental profile because they're annual or because they're perennial, and reduce erosion, some of these other things, and also be really productive and use them for biofuels. So the answer is yes. And they have large SOC sequestration, so organic carbon sequestration. So it's a good segue. Corn ethanol, what did that do for us? Well, let's find out. So we grow a lot of corn in the US. I don't know, it's like 80 million acres, maybe 90. It's really productive. It is a fantastic crop. It's one of the most productive crops we have, and that is, contributed to why it is so widespread on our landscape. And we use a lot of it for ethanol. I don't know the numbers for this past year, but it always ranges from about 30 to 40% of our corn crop goes to produce ethanol in the US. The rest of it is mostly for animal feed. And of that 30 or 40% that goes to an ethanol facility, you get some of that back. I think you get back like a third as food or as feed that can be fed to animals as dried distiller grains. It's this really high quality, higher protein, feed source. And so on net, I think it's like a quarter of our land that we grow corn on is essentially used for corn ethanol, biofuels. And that use is essentially facilitated and governed by this policy known as the Renewable Fuel Standard. So the Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS, it was created back in 2005 and then really expanded in 2007. And it essentially requires or mandates that ethanol and other biofuels be blended into the U.S. transportation fuel supply. But to date, it's been, I think, well over 90% of all the biofuel production has come from corn ethanol. It initially called for some of these other more advanced and cellulosic biofuels and grasses to be in the mix, but they haven't really been commercially online at the scales that were envisioned yet. So to date, it's predominantly been corn ethanol, some soybean biodiesel as well, and a few other smaller contributors. And so the things we really want to find out is like, well, how did U.S. land use respond to this policy, and what were the environmental outcomes of these changes? And we know from our other research, like what's going on in the landscape, that grasslands are being converted to croplands, but nobody really knew what role this policy and corn ethanol is playing in it. Is it just is it the main driver causing these land use changes, or is it really just a small piece of the puzzle because we use our lands for a lot of different things and a lot of different crops, and maybe this policy is just a drop in the bucket that we don't really need to be so concerned about. So that's what we tried to do. To do that, we have to look at essentially what would have happened in absence of corn ethanol development, and then compare that to what we actually observed. So to do that, we sort of set up this causal chain analysis where we said, okay, we have some policy, in this case, the Renewable Fuel Standard. It sets some minimum volumes of biofuels, and you can imagine that increase in demand results in an increase in crop prices. So the prices of corn will go up, the prices of other crops probably go up as well, because if you're using more land for corn, there's less land for soybeans and wheat, so demand or supply of those goes down and the price will go up. And that's going to change farmer behavior. They're going to switch their crop rotations to have more corn on the landscape and less other crops, and they're going to also change cropland area, so bring more land into crop production. And both of those have associated environmental impacts. That's kind of a boring slide. Essentially, it estimates that what was the effect of this policy. This renewable fuel standard stipulates how much additional biofuels need to be blended in our transportation fuel supply. And you can measure or estimate that impact at about 5.5 billion gallons a year of more corn ethanol that people, or that is refiners are required to blend into the transportation fuel supply. So that's like our starting sort of action that we want to measure the effect of. Whoop. And we can take that 5.5 billion gallons per year of increased corn ethanol demand from the renewable fuel standard and say, what did that do to prices? And here we estimate that impact of about increasing corn prices by about 30% each year, and kind of this cascading effect where switching crops from soy to corn increased then the price of soy and wheat as well. So those crop prices went up by about 20%. So it has the greatest impact on corn because it's directly utilizing corn as its feedstock, but that has some spillover effects on other crops due to kind of the interactions in the market. What does that increase in crop prices mean? Well, it's really not rocket science. As you would expect, if you increase the price of corn, you're going to get more corn on the landscape. So farmers planted more continuous corn, or like corn after corn year after year. Areas in red saw the greatest increase. So in a lot of the Midwest, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, we planted a lot more continuous corn. They also planted more corn in rotation. So like a corn soybean rotation or corn wheat rotation. Lots of that in the Dakotas. So what's going on there is places where people didn't used to grow corn, they used to just grow wheat, year after year, or wheat and soy. More corn is slipping into those rotations. And then in spots like Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, the amount of corn in rotation is going down because it's shifting to continuous corn and they're planting corn every year and they're doing less corn soy rotation. Overall, though, just the acreage of corn goes up, which is exactly what you'd expect if the price of corn goes up. Just as you would expect too, it also increases the amount of land in production. Farmers bring more land into production to meet that need, to meet that call that basically Congress put out and said, we want more ethanol, we want more corn to supply it. They say, okay, well, we'll bring more land into production through, the market essentially. And so we see a lot of cropland expansion kind of throughout the Western Great Plains. And some we see also less land that goes out of production. So less land like shifting into pasture for an overall net change and an increase in cropland area. These changes in cropland area increase carbon emissions and also, have other environmental impacts. So, we have carbon emissions from that land use change. There's additional nitrogen fertilizer that needs to be applied for those changes in crop and additional cropland. And with that, you get nitrous oxide emissions, increased nitrate leaching into groundwater, soil erosion, and other types of impacts. So a lot of different shifts associated with those land use changes. Big picture, just kind of to summarize it all, it's essentially what you'd expect. If we increase demand for ethanol by quite a bit, 5.5 billion gallons a year, we saw an increase in crop prices, so corn by 30%, other crops by about 20%, and then a shift in crop rotations, how we use our existing cropland, and a shift in cropland extent, so how much land we pull into and out of production. And all those resulted in, environmental impacts. I would say on average is, the environmental impacts of agriculture increased by about 3 to 5% across the sector, which sounds really low, right? Like we're creating a bunch of biofuels, a bunch of corn ethanol, and we only increase, the nitrate leaching from agriculture by 5%. But you think about it, that's like 5% of the entire agricultural industry. This is a huge industry, and you bump up the nutrient pollution by 5%. That's actually, I guess it depends on your perspective, but it results in a relatively big change. So one policy, really shifting the outcomes from an entire industry, an entire sector, in fact. And when you look at the carbon emissions from that land use change in particular, and bring that back into basically the overall life cycle impact of a fuel that's created from those feedstocks, that's where things also start to get interesting. So, we know biofuels have this great potential of offsetting and displacing petroleum, right? And being way better on a climate balance sheet, basically, than gasoline, because you're not pumping up fossil fuels from below the surface. And so, back in the day when we first proposed these rules, the government, EPA, modeled that ethanol was about 20% better. So this 20% reduction line signifies this is the greenhouse gas intensity of, grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of energy or fuel. They said, yeah, corn ethanol, I think it's about 20% better. The gasoline, that's good. That's good. Let's go with it. And that's kind of the requirement in this policy. But now in hindsight, we have retrospect, and we can say, nobody really thought there'd be this much land use change. But we've seen there actually is quite a bit, 5 million more acres of corn due to this policy and about 7 more million acres of overall cropland. I switched those two numbers, but in either case, quite a few more acres of corn and cropland and carbon emissions from that than everybody was expecting. And when you factor in those carbon emissions, in fact, it looks like the overall profile and greenhouse life cycle greenhouse gas intensity of corn ethanol could even be, in fact, higher than the gasoline we're trying to replace. And so really what we need to take, maybe a step back from this and say, this is an example, one example. We need to kind of rerun these entire calculations, and hopefully the EPA will do that to say, okay, with this new hindsight and perspective, what does that mean for the entire system? This was just a simplified reduction in the example, but it does suggest that we need to be careful about our policies and really just emphasize that we have to be cognizant of the land use change implications of these shifts. And I'm jumping to the chat to see a question. Oh, it's not up on that screen, but I see the chat, a question. Does the current biofuels LCA compared to other fuels include land use? Yes, I think, if that's the question. So current LCAs of biofuels, most of them do account for land, most account for land use. They do it with like modeling. I mean, everything, I mean, our results are partially modeled too, but when like, say they initially modeled and estimated the, carbon intensity of these fuels 10 years ago, I guess I kind of talked to us a little bit. They didn't expect as much land use change. So the amount of land use modeled into a lot of these estimates of life cycle assessments and energy returns on investment consider land use, but they consider much less land use than we've actually observed. And so that's kind of a big takeaway of our findings over the last few years is, man, we unfortunately have more land use than we were hoping and greater emissions. And when you factor that in, generally it increases the emissions of these fuels.
Is that sort of one of the main kind of pushbacks from, let's say, industry or others, that you came up with this study that shows way more land use change, and the industry said, well, we have these other studies that didn't say that there was as much carbon emissions?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So there are, right. It's a debated topic because there's like financial interests related to this policy. If you're somebody that's producing about corn ethanol, and a lot of the pushback on, I guess, some of the science that says, hey, there's land use change that we should be concerned about, or at least just factor in and try to minimize. They'll point to studies that say, oh, there wasn't that much land use change, or it'll model the land use change in a way that kind of mismatches with ecological research. They'll say like, oh, that grassland got planted to corn, but maybe that was good for soil carbon. And there are cases, because there are cases where like, oh, it could be if you add, improve management and stuff. But on whole, I think most in the scientific community would say, if you plow up a perennial grassland to plant an annual crop, you're going to be losing carbon from the soil, and then take that all the way through to a life cycle. It should have should be factored in a negative way, and some of that debate kind of, there's nuances there, I guess, that folks have looked at from multiple angles. Yeah. All right. Good question. There's another one. Oh yeah. As crops increase, does pesticide use increase? And thoughts on the EPA thoughts to increase more ethanol and biofuels blended into fuels? Jenny Watson. Yes, as crops increase, does pesticide use increase? Yes, I would think so, because we don't use a lot of pesticides on grasslands. I mean, some for certain things, but not to the extent that we do. And as I mentioned, corn is like this really intensive crop, right? It's like one of the highest nutrient input requirements, and also quite high pesticide use as well. So yes, that's something we didn't account for in our estimate directly. We looked at nutrient additions, nitrogen and phosphorus, but not pesticide, but it's a good consideration. And thoughts on the EPA. So the EPA just, I think on Thursday or Friday, they released the proposal of what biofuel blending requirements will be for the next 3 years. I haven't read them in depth, almost intentionally. I was like, oh, I'll save that for another time. But yeah, what our study just on corn ethanol, which is much different beast than the other biofuels, which I'm going to talk about in a second here. It really suggests like, corn ethanol is here. Now we have, 15 billion gallons a year, and it's makes up about 10% of our transportation fuel supply. It probably isn't going to deviate too much from that. But our study does suggest that if it were to increase, especially if it increases substantially, or if another similar commodity-based crop were to increase a lot, which could be something like soybeans, which is getting a lot of, soy biodiesel, especially for sustainable aviation fuels, is getting a lot of attention and potential future growth. If some commodity crops, if we, all of a sudden ratchet up demand for those, for the use of those crops as biofuels, it's what you would expect, right? There's going to be more of those crops on the landscape. That's going to cause land use change, and there's going to be, carbon and other environmental consequences from that. So our research kind of suggests, it's here to stay, and that's probably okay. But you wouldn't want to increase these, first generation conventional renewable fuels too much, or you would have to account for, those unintended environmental consequences. So that's probably my thoughts on that. Feel free to ask more questions though. I'll go through pretty quickly on these last few things to save more time for Q&A too, because that's the most fun. And we have a question, is there policy consideration for incentivizing cellulosic ethanol that may not require as much land use change? Yes, so it's in the renewable fuel standard to try to incentivize cellulosic ethanol. It just hasn't, I don't know, it hasn't been there commercially yet at the scales needed. And so the EPA can, they've like passed waivers every year or revise the amounts that are actually required. And I didn't look what the cellulosic blending volumes are in this new proposal going forward for the next 3 years. But there is still like hope and interest and a lot of great research going on trying to get these next generation cellulosic fuels online. And that's a great segue into the next couple of slides. So, yeah, skip this. Boring takeaways with the last point. Everybody's got it. So how do we do this better? How do we, take what we know is going on in the landscape, take what we've learned from, corn ethanol development over the last 15 years, and we've learned a lot. In some cases, it's been a great model to understand how we can replace a huge chunk, 10% of our oil-based, petroleum-based transportation fuel, and replace it with a renewable fuel, corn ethanol. And maybe we can use that as a model of how we can do something similar, but perhaps with a feedstock that also gives us a lot of co-benefits for the environment, like these grassland-based or other cellulosic biofuels. So that's what we're doing. The really cool thing is we're doing a lot of research right here at UW-Madison. So there's this great research center called the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. It's a Department of Energy funded collaboration between UW-Madison and Michigan State University. And the explicit mission of this Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center is to try to come up with sustainable production of fuels and chemicals and other products from energy crops grown here on marginal lands. It's kind of an interesting topic I'll touch on a little bit more, but the idea is essentially growing it from, dedicated crops, so not food crops, but crops designed to have these co-benefits of, can produce energy, but also good environmental benefits and environmental performance from non-agricultural areas or places that essentially minimize the competition with other crops like corn and soy and wheat and things that are traditionally used for food and feed. So that's the goal. What is the motivation in this term marginal lands? It's maybe something you've heard of. It's always thrown out in the discussion of biofuels. It's this nebulous term. It's a really bad one, but it's also useful, and that's a catch-all for like these types of lands that essentially embody these principles. Is we're trying to identify spots that would reduce competition between food and fuel or feed production and essentially try to minimize the indirect or induced land use change, right? Because we just saw why we don't want all this land use change. It's usually not good. Using more marginal-ish type lands can also help reduce the direct emissions when you like take that land and plant a bioenergy feedstock. And you can imagine if you have like an old degraded land, something that is not being productive anymore, maybe it's covered with an invasive species, right? An invasive grass or something that's doesn't have much wildlife value. You can use this potentially to restore degraded lands or increase the productivity of low productive lands, still provide some economic opportunities for farmers, and potentially achieve a lot of great co-benefits for water quality and biodiversity with some of these more advanced cellulosic biofuel feedstock crops. So that's the goal of them, and that's the thinking behind using marginal lands. In doing so, though, it's not just an automatic slam dunk. You have to think about comparing the use of that land to the alternatives. So, as we just talked about, corn is really productive. And so, it might take more land to grow some of these cellulosic feedstocks. So we have to think about that. If you're not harvesting it for bioenergy, could you be grazing it and using that directly for food production of raising livestock? There's this kind of emerging concept I think is pretty interesting of agrivoltaic. So kind of using land for both solar photovoltaic production and growing crops or other agricultural systems on the same land, kind of a land sharing approach. Or this idea of nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions and just restoring it, restoring land to prairie or forest and, using that natural carbon sequestration in the biomass. And that one, I actually would lump in bioenergy and cellulosic bioenergy with that. I mean, the idea between these next generation fuels is that you can essentially have a very biodiverse, perennial native grass mixture that looks just like this. And, what if you can imagine, what if you could have this and then harvest that once in a while, once a year in fact, you need disturbance to kind of maintain that grassland. So if you could harvest that and use that prairie mixture as a biofuel feedstock, not only would you get the additional carbon sequestration in the soil from those plants growing, you have the great biodiversity benefits of that, you would also get to harvest that biomass and displace all the petroleum that you can displace when you convert it into fuel. So I do think there's a huge opportunity here for these fuels. And even when you consider all the alternatives, there could be a massive upside. This kind of gets at that. So, okay, theoretically, we know we have to, cellulosic bioenergy has to compete against those alternative land uses. Is there space for it? And again, I think the answer is yes. This is a graphic, a kind of a concept graphic here. On the left is, if you think of like land and the highest quality land, like the best stuff, like this is your prime farmland, really rich soils in central Iowa that's super productive. And on the far right is like lower quality land, really hilly, rocky, sloped stuff that's not very productive, right? You can barely grow anything on it. There's probably a space for all of these, right? Like corn, we should probably be growing, food and feed crops on our highest, most productive lands where there's not much erosion and you can really get a lot of production from it. And so, and then on the other end of the spectrum, when you have huge sloping hills, rocky things, you probably can't cultivate much on it, but you can use that for nature, natural restoration or regeneration or grazing of livestock. And that's probably the highest and best use of the land there. But there's this whole area in the middle of, okay, it's probably not great for corn because it's a little bit more marginal and you get a lot of nutrient pollution and runoff, but you could be, cultivating these higher productive biomass crops or harvesting, the natural vegetation there and getting that additional displacement of fossil fuels by doing that, such that if you add up essentially the value of all ecosystem services, I really think there is a sweet spot of biomass and bioenergy. Right now, it's not prevalent or prolific on the landscape, and I think part of that is sort of the market valuation of ecosystem services, right? So right now, there's a lot of externalities of when we grow an acre of corn, we don't really pay for the acre of polluted waterways downstream that result from it. If you were to fully account for that, it would shift a lot of these lines towards what these dotted lines represent. And so as we kind of grapple with and come to terms with and maybe begin to value all the full suite of ecosystem services from our land production systems, I think then the opportunity for biomass and bioenergy just grows substantially because we realize that we can get all these co-benefits for land and water quality and wildlife habitat that just aren't fully being accounted for or valued right now. And so that's why my last case study says like, bioenergy, we have to have a little caution. I mean, as somebody who has, that caution on it, I'm also incredibly optimistic and still think there is a role for bioenergy and biomass to play in this decarbonization, because this decarbonization of the transportation sector in particular is a huge challenge, and there's not a lot of available options, and there's still going to be a need to kind of complement electrification for a lot of different applications. And so biomass and bioenergy and biofuels are, I think, one of the kind of few tools that we have to do that. So if we're going to do that, where is it going to come from, though? We want to minimize this land use change and land competition. This is just sort of a schematic of kind of thinking about our land base and the major chunks of it. We've got cultivated lands and our crop lands, which is a big pool, but there's also a lot of formerly cropped land. Some people call it abandoned croplands. I don't know, it's interesting terminology, but land enrolled in the CRP, or the Conservation Reserve Program. It's this federal set aside of conservation lands in the US, which is a big pool. There's a lot of land use for pasture and hay that could be co-managed perhaps for harvesting as a feedstock. And so that's what we focus on in this Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. And as we think towards the future of sustainable biofuels and where we can place them on the landscapes, it's finding these opportunities. And we are seeing there's actually quite a bit of opportunity. So there are a lot of formerly cropped lands that aren't in production anymore for one reason or another. And there's also a lot of creative solutions thinking about in our current cropland portfolio of how we could use that land in a higher or better use. So a lot of folks at Michigan State are kind of leading the way in the thinking and the research of using some of the lower quality lands that are already cropped. So like the edges of fields or along waterways where we maybe, or highly sloped areas that we, if you have a whole giant field, can you take the lowest productive areas or those unstable areas and put those into a cellulosic feedstock or other type of grassland that you could get production from, or with irrigation. There's a lot of spots across the country where we only irrigate every other year and then let land sit fallow for a year because there's not enough water, and they're like splitting the well water allotment with 2 different fields. And rather than letting it sit idle, could you plant a drought tolerant, low water demand cellulosic crop that would add a little production, add some cover instead of having a barren fallow field for a year, and harvest that kind of crop to get some biomass and have bioenergy production from it and offset some fossil fuels. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. How much? I mean, it's actually pretty large. So if we look at land that's kind of moved in and out of production over the last 10 years, it's about 30 million acres across the country. So a lot of this marginal land going in and out of production. There's a lot of idled land, so land in this conservation reserve program or other abandoned former crop lands. Overall, in these intermittently irrigated lands, you know, it's 75, 100 million acres of land. Now that is not all available. We can't just say like, oh yes, plant that all to cellulosic bioenergy. A lot of it is used for other things, right? There are trade-offs for all of those, but it does suggest that there is a large land pool out there, some potential opportunity, and it's a place to look at to essentially see, like, could this be an area where we can get a significant portion of bioenergy in a way that's, I would think, you know, a lot more environmentally friendly than a lot of the current conventional corn ethanol, and do it in a way that just, you know, has tons of co-benefits for the environment. So that's the opportunity. That's what we're looking for. Again, you know, you have to compare what are the alternative trade-offs. But when you look at all those, I do think, you know, that image in the upper right is a pretty good system. You know, if you can have that really biodiverse prairie and use that to produce some fuel that could offset petroleum, I mean, that looks like a win-win to me. And I think there's a place for it. I think there's a place for all 4 of these systems on the landscape, and it's finding the right spot and the right system for the right place. And so that's what we're looking for moving forwards. And that's, I think, where as society we may want to go as we continue to consider biofuels and bioenergy. That's it. That's my last slide. This is just if you're curious more, like, where is this land? Through the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, we've got this great atlas that we're continuing to add more data to as we identify things like where are these former croplands or these intermittently irrigated lands, like where are we actually potentially thinking about these opportunities. It's publicly available. You can just go to atlas.glbrc.org, and there's like little info buttons you can click on that describe the different land types. That is all I have got. I'm gonna swap over and check out the chat and take some questions. So yeah, fire away with any questions. I don't know if everybody just does them in the chat or if there's any verbal ones. Okay, cool.
You've already got it up there. Read it. Yeah, more of my comment, I guess, from Jenny is
okay.
Sort of more less optimistic about humans' ability to, you know, move things in the right direction, I guess.
Yeah, interesting information. Given history, given history of humans not considering or looking forward to impact of pesticides, runoff, destruction of wetlands, I am not optimistic. Also mentioning marginal lands concerns me about the impact on indigenous people's lands. Too much ignoring history. Yeah, really good points. You know, we're trying to learn from history, I think, especially, you know, bioenergy and corn ethanol, and trying to learn from that experience and experiment to try to think more carefully about it moving forwards. Certainly the indigenous land concerns are very important. You know, most of what we've done for mapping it, and when we're, you know, all those numbers I just threw out, none of that is on tribal lands or indigenous people's lands. That's land that's like in federal programs that the U.S. government is already like paying farmers not to farm in the Conservation Reserve Program. And so thinking about ways that we might be able to do that a little bit better or not compete with ourselves against the crop insurance program, which is incentivizing, you know, more corn on that land. You're right that it's a big challenge. I think well, so is climate change though, right? So we have to do something, and fossil fuels really suck, to be quite frank and forward. I don't know, maybe I should say that, but yeah, I could say that, right? Fossil fuels are bad. We can't continue on the trajectory we are, so we need some solutions. And so looking at the full range, I think, is important. And all of the IPCC and UN projections to get us down to a 1.5 degree or 2 degree Celsius warming trajectory, they all have huge amounts of bioenergy included in those projections and in those portfolios. And so figuring out where that might come from and doing that, trying to do that in a way that minimizes the impacts on the environment and people, I think is something that we want to do. Otherwise we might end up with corn from sea to sea. So yeah, I don't know whether or not we want to be optimistic or not. I'm optimistic, at least to some extent, and stay that way. But you're right to be cautious as well. So cautiously optimistic is maybe my approach. Let's see, any other questions? Another one from Jenny. Oh, and the Q&A. Let's see. I'll follow up on the same one. Why are pesticides needed for corn and other products used for ethanol and feed? Wouldn't the pesticides be released into the air as well as runoff? Yes, yeah. I don't know, man. Pesticides. There's a whole debate on it. I'm not an expert on pesticides, but there's definitely a lot of challenges to a lot of cropping systems that we have right now, and I think a little diversification would probably be a good solution too. And another question in the Q&A. How does the recent effort to sequester CO2 from ethanol plants in Iowa change the overall calculation? Oh, good question. Yeah. Carbon capture and storage, right? I mean, I don't know. I'll admit that I am not an expert on carbon capture and storage, nor do I have a great insight on what that might mean. I mean, that if you think about it, that we already have this 15 billion gallon per year corn ethanol industry here. Capturing some of that CO2 seems promising and probably a beneficial thing, right? There's also a lot of considerations and trade-offs, and like going back to the land rights and indigenous groups, like you're building a big pipeline, maybe, there's some trade-offs there. There's probably some trade-offs if it's then incentivizing further land use change and people if all of a sudden corn ethanol has a greater ranking of its environmental benefits in some of these policies, if that incentivizes further land use change, maybe then there's some mitigation of the potential benefits of those carbon capture pipelines. But I do think they do have promise too, and I've seen some good analyses looking at like, what if you combine carbon capture and storage with some of the cellulosic bioenergy potential? Like, wow, you would really have a really strongly net negative fuel potential, and perhaps one of our only like viable, strong, what do they call it? CDR, carbon dioxide removal mechanisms, right? If we're already going to overshoot where we need to be as a society, we need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's where I've seen a really strong argument of why we do need to consider biofuels and bioenergy. And if you can pair some of these better next generation cellulosic biofuels with something like carbon capture and storage, that might be one of the most viable options for doing that. So I think you got to consider it.
Negative emissions is the other term besides
right, because there's not a ton of solutions for that, and a lot of them are pretty wild. And so I think it's definitely something. I'm glad people are looking into it. I'm glad people are looking into it from all sides of like the opportunity it has and the potential challenges, so that we just like with the bioenergy question, that we enter it with a open mind and try to do the best we can.
I guess just the CO2 that's captured, that's just kind of the CO2 that's naturally coming from the fermentation process, right? So that doesn't capture any of the CO2 when you actually burn the ethanol. So it's a smaller percentage of that fuel, what actually gets released.
Yes. Yep. Right. It's like trying to grab that low hanging fruit from the processing, whatever, during that fermentation and the other processing, heating processes. Like if you can at least capture some of that, you'll reduce, I guess I didn't show slides, but you have emissions all throughout the production of a fuel, from the land use to the making of the fertilizer to then the distilling of the ethanol. And I think and then to the burning it out on the tailpipe. And the idea is if you can at least capture some of those or more all at each of those steps, that would be a good thing. And so that's the idea between carbon capture and storage.
I think we're at time and I don't see any more questions online unless you have any more questions here in the room.
To point out that often these plans to reopen new lands to agriculture turn out very disastrously. Like in North Korea's example, that would have been the Virgin Lands program in Russia, where they tried to cultivate the subarctic.
Yes, yeah, right, definitely, and that's where, at least where we're mapping this land availability and thinking about opportunities for cellulosic biofuels. We're thinking the things we're mapping are former croplands, so areas that have been cropped before, have a profile, cultivation history, and maybe now are degraded or have, been taken over by a single species of grass and not giving a lot of biodiversity benefits. So trying to stay out of native grasses and pristine ecosystems, I think, as much as possible. And, trying to advocate for ensuring those protections are written into the policies as well, so that we don't, accidentally incentivize that, because that's definitely a outcome that we won't want to see. Yes, good point. Yeah.
Also, I was curious about one of your maps showing areas that are being recultivated. Are many areas actually going back to oranges? That's kind of interesting.
I don't know, like down in Florida and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if they're going into tree crops and horticultural crops yet. I don't have a good pulse of that. Of what's growing. I know, like down in the southeast, we're seeing like some crop, like peanuts and things, going in on lands that used to be timber. And so we're capturing that as like crop expansion. But also, yeah, not sure about the fruit crops and things like that. Cool.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Tyler, and it's a great discussion all around.
All right, thanks. Yeah, feel free to reach out. My contact info is here, so you can email me and check out our website and get in touch if you're watching this in the future. I'll be around next semester too if you're watching it if you're watching this in the future. I'm now talking to the future. I'll see you next year.